connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, before we move to the session proper, I'd just like to run through a couple of housekeeping notes. You would be aware that we have placed you all on mute, but we really do encourage you to interact with us during the session. So there is the chat box. If as questions come up, you'd like to put some questions in the chat box, every now and then we will stop and Jackie will ask, and I'll introduce Jackie in a minute. If there are any questions, I'll read those questions out. If we need further clarity, we will bring you and ask you to unmute and further clarity. We really do want you to ask a lot of questions throughout the session. And again, if I can just remind everybody to try and keep their computers on mute. It just makes the recording a lot easier. So I am now going to, without further ado, introduce Jackie. We're very, very fortunate to have Jackie, who, go believe it, Jackie, do you know what? I don't know what I've done with your bio, and here it is. Here we go. So Jackie is the Acting Senior Director of Strategy, Occupational Hygiene at Worksafe ACT. Jackie's a work health and safety inspector and a member of the Australasian College of Toxicology, Risk Assessment, the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists and the Faculty of Asbestos Management Australia and New Zealand. Wow. She has a postgraduate qualification in public health, epidemiology and biostatistics and has trained as a regulatory toxicologist. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us today, and I know that everybody's really looking forward to your presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Kerry. I hope you can all see and hear me. Because I'm sharing my screen, all I can see is our slideshow. So as Kerry said, I'm Jackie, I'm from Worksafe ACT. And what we're going to talk about today is about working towards COVID normal. So the ACT is working towards reopening and releasing restrictions and working out what COVID normal looks like. For National Disability Services, there are some very specific things that we're going to have a chat about, and we're going to talk about your duties, how you might go about them, and what an inspection actually looks like. So Worksafe ACT, we are here in Canberra, based in Civic. Under the Work Health and Safety Act, the Work Health and Safety Commissioner, Jacqueline Aegis, lovely lady, is the regulator for work health and safety, workers' compensation and labour hire licensing. We're an independent entity in that we also regulate the ACT government. So we're not connected to the government to make sure that we can complete our regulatory functions. So we do a number of things. We provide information, advice and support. We provide education. We do a lot of engagement with the community. We also, of course, do our compliance and enforcement activities. Our aim is for a safe, fair and productive working lives for all Canberrans. And we do that under a number of acts and regulations. So it's not just the Work Health and Safety Act and regulation. We've also got dangerous substances and dangerous goods, scaffolding and lifts, machinery, dangerous substances. We get to do all the fireworks licensing, the Labour Hire Licensing Act and the Workers' Compensation Act. So when we look at the primary duty under the Work Health and Safety laws, it's about providing a workplace that is free from risks to health and safety for workers and for others. So those duty holders need to eliminate those risks where they can, and where they can't, they must minimise them so far as reasonably practicable. When we think about COVID-19, COVID-19 is a biological hazard under the Work Health and Safety laws. We have other examples of infectious diseases that are covered under the laws, and COVID-19 is no different. So part of complying with this requirement is staying up to date. So we know that with Work Health and Safety, there's actually a lot of crossover and a lot of different frameworks when you're a business that you need to comply with. It's not just Work Health and Safety. You might have privacy, industrial relations, things like that. So to be able to comply fully as a business, when it comes to COVID-19, we also have to make sure that there's compliance with the public health directions. So for disability services, that goes around vaccinations, which we're going to talk about, COVID safety plans. So every workplace must have a COVID safety plan. The use of personal protective equipment, which for the ACT, most of that seems to come from the Commonwealth Department of Health, who provides some really good guidance, and also around isolation and quarantining procedures when there is an exposure. So as I said, we've got the primary duty of care. So protecting workers and others at the workplace is your primary duty of care. And you do that by either eliminating or managing the risk. So managing the risk is around using the hierarchy of controls. And again, it's no different for a COVID-19 safety plan. The key thing I think that we have certainly found coming out of lockdown and as businesses are re-emerging into workplaces is that the COVID-19 safety plan is not the only part of a safe work system. It is only part of it. The COVID safety plan will certainly be a key part of it as we're coming out, but you need to actually put in place control measures that manage all of the risks at the workplace and integrate COVID-19 as a part of that. To do that, it's not an easy, simple sort of approach. It is a complex approach and it's informed by your risk assessments. So when you were looking at COVID-19, you need to integrate the advice and the requirements of the departments of health. So what's in the public health directions, what kind of guidance is available, the type of PPE you need to use. And particularly for disability services, you might need to do a risk assessment specific to each workplace. From what I understand, from what Kerry and Susan have told me is there are such a wide range of workplaces that are covered under disability services. We can have the really high level face-to-face support down to the supported independent living, and also where maybe there is an early intervention for a newly diagnosed disability. So implementing a COVID-19 safety plan, you may actually have to look at each and every workplace that you have, who is there, what those risks look like, and apply controls specific for that workplace. So examples that you can use in the hierarchy of control I've got up there. So elimination, we know we can't eliminate COVID-19 at the moment, unfortunately, but we can eliminate some of the risk in that we can remove or restrict people with symptoms from entering the workplace. An isolation control, that goes around the density and the physical distancing. So isolation is about removing the risk and making a space in between it. So our quarantining and isolation procedures are part of that, but we also need to make sure we look at that physical distancing. We can substitute, so we can change procedures and processes to minimise the risk. We can add in engineering controls. So there's a lot of work being done around ventilation, but we also have our cleaning processes and our vaccinations. So those are actually physical things that we can use to minimise the risk. Once we've implemented those higher level controls, it is only then where a risk still remains that administrative controls are applied. We do have some mandatory ones, such as the QR sign-ins, but as a workplace, you can also look at rosters, infection control policies, and signage. And that signage can either be around removal or restriction, or that signage can also be around this is the policy at this workplace and you must comply with it. And then again, where there is still a risk that remains, that's when we look at personal protective equipment to support those other controls. So masks, gloves, face shields, and gowns. The other thing that we have absolutely seen as a regulator coming out of lockdown is around the psychosocial hazards of COVID-19. So the psychosocial hazards, excuse me, around COVID-19 can be anxieties about the virus itself, or they can also be around like coming back to work. So some of the common hazards are very, sorry, excuse me, frog in my throat. They're very clear as we're coming back into work because of, COVID has made such a big change to how we live and do things. So we're seeing more issues around job control, overload, support. Isolated and remote work. You might have part of your workforce who are working from home full time, and that can be really difficult to do on a long-term period, even on a short-term period. Of course, these hazards then turn into quite observable behaviours around bullying, aggression, and exposure to traumatic events. And that can, of course, we've got stress, fatigue, burnout. When we're looking at psychological injuries and illness, we want to look at a preventative phase. So incorporating a review of the psychological hazards in a new risk assessment is really important. The other really, really big thing as we're coming back into the workplace is consultation. So once you've done a risk assessment, you've got a draft risk assessment there, you think you've got your control measures in place, this is where you go and you consult with your workers. And the questions that you're asking your workers are not emotional questions about how are you feeling. They are objective questions about, will this combination of control measures work to do your task? An example of that, of course, might be if you are head to toe in PPE and gloves, can you actually perform the service that you need to? Without tripping over something, ripping something, or being unable to actually complete that task. The other questions are around whether or not the control measures that you're putting in place add any additional risk. So as we're coming into summer in Canberra, is wearing a huge load of PPE actually then going to put that worker at risk of heat stress, for example? The other questions are around comparability. So when you put in place your control measures and you have a small workplace, are those control measures a little bit over the top, or are they comparable to the risk and the task that you are undertaking at that workplace? Again, always refer to the most recent public health guidance, and during your consultation there are definitely going to be control measures that you need to put in place that are mandatory. So being able to communicate that to your workers and have an understanding of how they are going to manage that is very important as the PCBU. And then of course induction, training and supervision. As a regulator, we see some really great induction processes, we see some wonderful training, and then we don't actually see the supervision. Administrative controls and PPE are reliant on worker behaviour. So supervision after you've done induction and training is really important to make sure that your workers are doing everything they are supposed to stay safe. It's also going to help you to see whether or not what you've implemented actually works. So, Worksafe ACT inspectors. We are quite a small regulator, of course. ACT is quite small. We have about 30 inspectors. The inspectors are out 7 days a week conducting inspections. Our inspections generally come from two pathways, one being reactive, when we get a notifiable incident, an inquiry or a complaint. So we might go out to a workplace based on those, or our proactive campaigns. And these are our scheduled campaigns. Sometimes we do what's called a saturation campaign, where all of the inspectors will go out on one day to do an inspection in a certain suburb or for a certain industry. When an inspector comes, the inspector will be talking with, of course, the PCBU. We'll identify who that is and try our absolute best to get in contact with them to have them there on site with us. The health and safety representatives, if there are any, and we also talk to the workers. When we're there, we're going to ask about workers' compensation, about labour hire licensing. We're going to ask how you do things, why you do things, and we're also going to ask to see documentation around risk assessment, policies, training, and anything else that's relevant for the task that you undertake. When an inspector is there, we might take notes, we might take photographs, we might ask for more information to be given to us after the inspection. We may issue on-the-spot notices, and I'll talk about what they might be, and we might schedule a follow-up visit. So when we come in for an inspection, our first step is gathering information. This will both be the inspector observing and gathering reasonable evidence, as well as talking to people who are there. So the biggest things we're looking for are what are the hazards and what risks do they pose. Once we've identified that, we then gather more information about the risk assessments and the control measures that are put in place at that workplace and understand how they work together and how they are applied. From that, we do a gap analysis. So that's where we actually compare what is being done at the workplace with the work health and safety laws or any of those other acts that we have, depending on what workplace you're at. And we look at the primary duty of care, and we look at reasonably practicable. So this is a really big thought process, and we might ask a lot of questions of the PCBU to really understand the reasonably practicable and how that applies at the workplace. We may then issue an enforcement notice. We will absolutely do a workplace visit report. So every visit, we will issue a report to the PCBU. So the enforcement notices we have at hand are improvement notices, prohibition notices, and infringements. So our improvement notices are nothing to be afraid of. They are there to help you do a little bit better. They're nothing that is going to, you know, put a black mark against your name or against your workplace. They're just there to help you to do better. They will be very detailed around why you are getting an improvement notice, and they will also give recommendations about how you can comply with that improvement notice, and they will also have a time limit on when you are to implement that change. Prohibition notices are generally issued on the spot for highly hazardous work. So that is where the inspector will actually stop work at that workplace or stop a task at that workplace because it is very, very dangerous. An infringement notice is actually where we issue a fine. They will generally not be on the spot. They will generally come afterwards, but that's where you will be issued with a fine for your dangerous work. So after we've issued that workplace visit and whether or not there are any notices, we do a little bit more analysis. So we will probably review any paperwork or documentation that you provided to us, just to make sure that everything's all kosher. And then we have our verification and follow-up. So that could be a phone call, that could be a follow-up inspection, that could be a request for a photograph to show that you have implemented any recommendations from a notice. It is a very cyclical, as I've tried to sort of show on this slide. An inspection, we're not out there to pin you. We're actually out there to try and make sure that everyone is safe. Any of the fines or infringement notices we don't get to keep. They all go into the ACT government bank. So when we're out there also, we're not out there trying to meet any KPIs or any dollar signs that's requested. We are purely out there for safety reasons. When it comes to COVID-19, we do have authorisation under the public health directions. So we can stop work and we can issue fines on the spot for a COVID infraction as well. We have not yet used that because we think it's a little bit hard, to be honest. Everyone is absolutely trying their best. In Canberra, we're doing really, really well, and there aren't any people out there who are maliciously doing the wrong thing. But that sort of wraps up my presentation. I'm hoping we've got lots of questions. Questions, concerns, queries. If you see something that's not quite right, we can contact us by phone 24/7. You can email us. You can also report a concern or a notifiable incident on our webpage. We do have the ability to take any communication confidentially. Sometimes, particularly around psychosocial hazards, there is a real sensitivity around having to identify oneself. So please don't be afraid to reach out to us. All of the inspectors are absolutely wonderful and we are here to help. So Kerry, I'm going to pass back to you and maybe we've got some questions.
Thank you, Jackie. Look, I've got a question at the moment, because I'm going to warm everybody up, because there aren't any questions yet. Your presentation has been really, really good. Look, one of the things that concerns that I've had recently from a number of our members is that they have some of their participants, so people without disability, who are receiving some support from them, who haven't been vaccinated. And because vaccinations are now mandatory for disability workers, there is some real concern around, well, how do they handle that if that staff member says, I don't feel comfortable working with somebody who is not vaccinated. I don't know what my work health and safety obligations are. How am I breaching anything through, Worksafe, ACT? So I know that's a complex question, but what would be your first thoughts to say in that sort of situation?
No. So that's where we refer to our risk assessment. We have a look at our risk assessment. Oh, sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, you're back. You have your video has frozen, but you are back now. So it might need to turn your camera off, Jackie.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's I think because you keep freezing.
All right, let's do that.
Voice is what we need to hear. As gorgeous as you are, we really need to hear your voice at this point. So.
Sorry about that.
No.
So when we're looking at vaccination status, either of a client.
Oh dear, I think we don't have great audio now.
Are you there?
We are. I don't know what's happening with our audio at this point of time, Jackie. Which is just bizarre because it was going so well. Do you want to try again?
Yes.
No, we are.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I can certainly see you.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
We're talking about the vaccination status of a client or of a worker, because there may be examples where a worker cannot medically have a vaccination, for example. It's around looking at that risk assessment. So we know that non-vaccinated people can both be more likely to catch COVID. They are more likely to have a more severe case of COVID, and they are more likely to share COVID. So that is a risk around managing that biological hazard. So in your risk assessment, you need to include that around the transmission and how you can, what control measures you can put in place to minimise that transmission. If there is a worker who is uncomfortable working with a client who is unvaccinated, the discussion and the consultation then with that worker is around the control measures in place and how effective they are. When you consult with a worker, you do have to take their position into account. You can't just say, well, I'm sorry, you're just going to work with them. You do actually need to listen to them and understand. And it also, again, that goes into our psychosocial hazards as well, because you do not want a worker to have low control over their job and then have a psychosocial injury. Sometimes when you look at the vaccination status, your risk may go from medium to high, which means you must implement as many controls as you can. That you do also then have the opportunity to use that isolation level and actually put that worker, for example, on to work in a different section of the house, to only undertake specific tasks that will minimise their exposure as well. You also have the opportunity of, in disability services, you do have to provide that service. That is your sole job for being. So that could also look at having that worker on administrative duties, for example. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I might just add a little bit to that as well, Jackie, just for some people who are online, that you know, one of the things I think we're all aware of is, particularly if a participant receiving funding under the NDIS is unvaccinated, you as providers need to be very conscious of the code of conduct, which, you know, it makes it very hard for you, you know, to deny support and care to somebody. So it is very much around, as Jackie said, looking at how you then mitigate the risk to you know, both the participant, but also to your worker. So now, I have another question here. Is the only vaccination exemption medically based?
So at the moment, sorry, you can have a medically based exemption. So these are people who cannot get the vaccination due to a number of reasons. There are also the Fair Work Commissioner is also issuing temporary exemptions under the Fair Work Act. So there may be additional exemptions there. Again, a worker can provide those to you. You can ask for them, but the worker doesn't have to give them to you. But you need to then decide whether or not that worker is high risk. So you will also have, we've come across it quite a bit, where some workers are absolutely happy to tell you they're double vaxxed. There's a couple of them are ready to be triple vaxxed. There are other workers who do not want to share the vaccination status, and they do not have to. But as the PCBU, you then need to make the decision about how you classify that worker. And if you don't know their vaccination status, then whether or not they are high risk in your workplace and how you're going to manage that.
Brilliant. Thank you for that one. Jackie, we have another question. Can you legally ask clients if they are vaccinated, given this is a personal health information?
So, as I said, you can ask, but you cannot compel. If you ask, of course, any personal health information is confidential. Any records that you receive are confidential and must be recorded as such. So yes, you can ask, but they don't have to tell you.
Brilliant. Look, thank you. Now, at the moment, there are no questions coming through the chat. Can I, at this point of time, maybe ask people to even put their hand up and come forward and ask some questions? You know, this is an absolute wonderful opportunity for us to share Jackie's knowledge and to have all our questions answered. Very shy bunch this morning, Jackie. Very unusual for the ACT sector.
Yeah.
So, Jackie, I have a question from Jackie. So, Jackie, do you want to unmute yourself? And happy for you to ask Jackie a question.
Sure. Okay. Sorry for the rain noise in the background. We've just got a downpour here. Are you providing any sort of kit to providers so that they can understand their responsibilities with COVID and how they, like you've just done this presentation, but is there something that would help providers to navigate all their responsibilities under COVID?
So one of the things we certainly did for the construction industry, so we had large-scale construction open on the 3rd of September and residential construction reopen on the 10th. There were a lot of requirements under both the public health directions and the work health and safety laws on that reopening. And what we pulled together there was actually a checklist. And that checklist outlined absolutely every duty that you needed to comply with to reopen safely. I would be really happy to work with Kerry and the team to pull together a similar checklist. I will need your information around the public health requirements for your industry, but that is absolutely something we can do. And if it's really helpful to you, very happy to do it.
Yep, that'd be much appreciated, because I think there's a lot of confusion and concern, and with the negative press about the percentage of people who have received the vaccination in the disability sector, I think it just makes everybody anxious and uncertain about, well, what does that mean for me? So that would be fantastic. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
And so, Jackie, we'll make sure we also make sure you've got the correct health orders and that are related to our sector. Look, have a clarification here from Hugh, and he basically is just saying that his understanding is that we are required to track and report on the vaccination status of staff to comply with the public health order. So, and I think that was my understanding. Is that your understanding, Jackie, or not?
Yeah, that's my understanding. So, but part of that tracking, I don't know about the reporting. That's something, Kerry, that I might leave to whether or not you have to report that back to the Department of Health. But tracking it means you can ask. And like I said, they don't have to say yes. So your tracking and recording, for example, may be a yes, no, or information not provided. And for our purposes, in you using vaccination as a control measure, that is acceptable to us, as long as you have asked and you have an answer. For the reporting back up to the Department of Health, I'm sorry, I'm not sure about those processes.
Okay. So look, Hugh, we might take that one on notice, just to go back and just check around whether there is a reporting requirement. So and get back to you on that one, because I'm not 100% sure, because I actually have heard some different things. So, and I don't know whether there's anyone online who can answer that question. But look, we'll see what we can find out and get back to everybody on this webinar. So, all right, we have another question here. What is Worksafe's process for when a worker reports feeling unsafe COVID-wise in their workplace? So that's assuming they have reported to their workplace directly and have not received a satisfactory outcome and have then approached Worksafe. So, and also they want to know, what is the working relation between Worksafe ACT and ACT policing on COVID legislation? That's
sure. So we do receive complaints around an example of feeling unsafe COVID-wise in the workplace. So yeah, our process is, first of all, to check that they have raised it with the appropriate people in their workplace, because workplaces should have policies in place to manage those sorts of concerns and inquiries. If they're unhappy with that outcome and they have come to Worksafe ACT, we record that as a case and investigate it formally. So that includes, firstly contacting the person who made the complaint to gather information around that complaint, and then whether or not they would like to remain anonymous or whether they're happy to be the namer of that complainant. And then we would follow up with the PCBU. So that would become a workplace visit, and we would schedule that in to ensure that the PCBU was there and anyone, relevant was there. So it would be investigated, as I showed on the slide, for gathering information and gap analysis, etc.
Brilliant. Look, thank you for that.
And then, sorry, the second one was around our relationship with ACT policing. We have a very close relationship with ACT policing on COVID matters. We have, I think it's twice the weekly meetings with them, and we've also had joint campaigns with them. So we work very closely with ACT policing. They are our preference for any COVID-related enforcement, because they have much more weightier powers, shall we say, under their legislation around it. So we work with them very closely.
Oh, that's really good to hear. And so I knew our Brains Trust from people out there come forward as well. So, and just confirming that, the reporting is back to the NDIS Commission, and yes, that would be for NDIS participants. So thank you for that, Avnesh. I know that I've got a question around for people who aren't NDIS participants, because there are some people with disability who aren't funded under the NDIS. So I'm keen to hear what the requirements are about that. And so we'll get back to everybody about that. And also, Jackie Tweeds has basically said that anyone in the sector can receive free assistance through SERBEC based in Queanbeyan. And please feel free to email Jackie. Her email is actually in the chat. So now, Pam, I see that you've got your hand up. So would you like to ask a question, Pam?
Thanks, Kerry. If you actually have a worker that has a genuine medical exemption, and I have to say the process of getting that is proving to be very, very frustrating. We've had a couple of workers that have tried 2 or 3 times and not had success in getting responses and proper processes with the Chief Health Officer. That's one thing. But the other is, if that worker comes back with an exemption into the workplace, what's your advice, Jackie, on managing that? Because they are then an unvaccinated worker potentially working with disability clients. And we may not have administrative tasks and other things for them to do. We do have one case where we have a family that's really happy to have that worker. I presume we then assess that risk and so on, but that's not all her shift. She does other things as well. So just wondering how you would manage that process.
So it is really tricky, Pam. And again, it's down to those control measures. For some workplaces, as I sort of said in the slides, that ventilation factor can really make a big difference. So we have our physical distancing, we have our PPE, we have our COVID safe procedures. Sometimes when you add in that extra ventilation, that is one way to have a look at it. Of course, though, when you're in somebody's house providing that service, that may be more difficult. It would be a consultation with that worker around what work is available to them, and that may mean that they cannot undertake some tasks or they cannot undertake some work, and you're going to have to consult with them. It may end up with that worker being unable to work full-time anymore, or you being unable to provide them with that full-time work.
I'm assuming you would need to consult with the participants that they work with.
Because they are others in the workplace and you have a duty towards those, yes, you do. And you need to, like I said, with risk assessments and consultation, it is difficult with COVID, because COVID it's caused a lot of high stress. It's highly sensitive. People are emotionally connected to it. But when you're undertaking these risk assessments and this consultation, you really need to try and be objective about what will work and what will not, and making your decisions based on that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. It's a really tricky one to manage, isn't it? Do you have any information about the process? I've got, a really frustrated worker who's just had a dreadful time trying to get through, has a medical exemption from the GP, but then you have to put it through the CHO, and it's just not clear what that process is. It's been incredibly frustrating.
I've got some connections over there. Let me ask the question and see what I can provide back to you, if that's okay.
Would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Kerry, it's Susan Cameron here. I just wanted to, on that particular query that Pam had, just ask Jackie if it's also the obligation of the provider to talk to co-workers of that unvaccinated worker to assess whether there's a risk with them working with someone who is unvaccinated.
Yes, that would absolutely form part of that, Susan, yeah.
thank you.
Because you can, of course, you can, even though you are double vaccinated, you can still catch COVID. So there is still a risk there. So the consultation and the control measures put in place have to cover those co-workers as well.
Great, thanks.
Lovely. Thank you for that, everybody. Now, we just a few bits of information again, just people, confirming that, the reporting requirement is through the Quality and Safeguards Commission. So that's for NDIS participants. And just, a reminder that we all do need to report that for people under the providing support under NDIS to the Commission of the staff vaccination by the 17th of December. A very interesting dilemma here, and I know one that is a challenge in supported independent living houses. Most all have sleepover shifts, and staff really can't sleep in PPE. Do you have suggestions for this challenge? So this is a tricky one, Jackie. I'm keen to this one.
So I will need to ask a couple of questions for this one before answering it.
Yes.
When staff have these sleepover shifts, do they have their own room, or are they sleeping in the same room as the clients? Are they sleeping in a common area, or does it depend on the house?
So Hugh, I'll let you answer this because this was your question. So
yeah, they would all have their own room, but they would be required through the night to get up on occasions if there is care which needs to be delivered to the other people in the house. So theoretically they'd be asleep, they'd have to then don, get up, go, come back, retake, try and go back to sleep. And there might be, probably in most houses that'd be 2 or 3 times a night.
Yep. So they don't need to sleep in their PPE if they are in a separate room. And I certainly wouldn't ask staff to sleep in PPE. I think that adds an additional risk. But yes, it will actually have to include that doffing and donning and making sure that there are amenities available for that worker to do that away from the clients, because you don't want to have dirty PPE in any common areas or anything like that. It's going to be trickier for the staff to do that, but if PPE is required, that's unfortunately what is going to have to happen, but they don't have to sleep in PPE.
thank you for that, Jackie. Now, at the moment, we don't appear to have any more questions. Any hands up? We've got a few minutes left, with Jackie. So any burning questions that people would like to ask at this point of time, very, very happy for you to put your hand up now.
Kerry, it's Sue here again. For some reason, I can't put my hand up, and I do apologise for that. I've got several things happening on the screen, but I just wanted to ask Jackie whether, if an organisation is concerned about whether they're complying fully with the Worksafe standards, can they request a visit from Worksafe to come to their organisation to look through the procedures and provide input?
Yes. So one of the things we have been doing, particularly for large scale construction, is we actually review their COVID safety plans and their safe work method statements. So if it is something that you do require help on, you can ask us to come out and have a visit. Yes.
Great, thanks.
No, it appears, I'm just see whether I have anything here. Okay, so just a bit of a statement. Jackie, just a risk assessment template from Worksafe ACT would be highly beneficial to all the disability service providers. So we will, Jackie, liaise with you around that, if that's okay.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you guys a question if there wasn't any, which is around risk assessments. And when you have reviewed your risk assessments, have you found them to be lacking? How are you guys actually finding the additional PPE? And have you made any significant changes other than sort of the COVID-19 requirements? Have you found any gaps that you can share?
So everybody, this is where I'm going to call from you who are working on the ground, because I think, NDS's experience of COVID is very, very different from you all who are on a day-to-day basis, working with people. So can I just get someone from out there to just maybe provide some information to us here, please?
Just Hugh again. Perhaps a new challenge is that being vaccinated masks the symptoms of COVID. So if you have a fully vaccinated workforce but potentially non-vaccinated clients, it's not as evident that people are suffering symptoms, and so it can sneak in unannounced, I guess.
Yep, that's very, very true, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest hurdles that we're going to have to cross is that asymptomatic case and an unknowing asymptomatic case who may still pass it on, and that's I'm not sure how we're going to tackle that, to be really honest. We are tackling that here as an inspectorate ourselves, because we are all, again, we've as a group decided that double vaccinations is the way we're going to go. And where we are, Worksafe ACT, we're on one floor. So we have all of our corporate team, our finance team, our executive who don't go out on inspections in the same space as our inspectors. And our inspectors, of course, are out on multiple workplaces a day. And how are we going to detect that transmission? So for us, and of course, it's going to be different out in the households because of the function that you guys deliver. We are making very clear sort of separations. So we have pods in here. People are not supposed to leave their pods, to try and use virtual stuff as much as we can, to again try and limit any exposure or possible exposure where we've got that asymptomatic. For you guys, I think it's something that, again, part of doing a good risk assessment is reviewing it. So unfortunately, for some things, you have to review it after an incident rather than being able to do it proactively. But that continual review and that feedback from what's happening on the ground will be really important in managing how we're moving forward with that.
Okay, thank you for that, Jackie. We've actually had another question that's come through. Is there an expectation from Worksafe ACT Health for any workplaces to implement rapid antigen testing at this point or in the near future?
That is such a good question. Rapid antigen testing is, I think, going to be a new stepping stone. We have no expectations for using it at the moment, but it is something that is being implemented for various industries. For example, transport. I know that transport use rapid antigen testing quite regularly. We keep in touch with the Therapeutic Goods Association. I've got some contacts over there and the team that are actually working out how to use rapid antigen testing. And it does look like it is quite effective at identifying COVID prior to having a PCR. But we don't have an expectation. ACT Health, I think, are following any national guidance in that area, which I don't think that's firm guidance at the moment. But it is a way that you could consider to be able to, track any infections in your workforce, noting that, it isn't 100% effective at finding it. But I've been told that if you have 2 rapid antigen tests 3 to 4 hours apart, that is 98% accurate. So that's actually a pretty good percentage. It's about, you can absolutely adopt it if that is something that you want to adopt at your workplace, to be able to manage transmission, or manage people coming back from holidays, because, you know, once the borders reopen, people are coming to and from holidays. Rapid antigen testing may be a way that you want to ask your staff to do before they start a shift. It is a perfectly acceptable control measure as part of your combination.
Oh, look, that sounds like, you know, a very wise approach as well. So, Jackie, we've got just another response going back to the risk assessment. Avnish has actually said that our risk assessments are more to gather information around ongoing and permanent risks, whereas with COVID-19, there can be short-term risks that needs to be assessed and addressed separately. So a new assessment tool may be very helpful. Okay. Any other questions, people? We've got 5 minutes left, and happy to have one more question if anyone would like to put their hand up. Very quiet here in the ACT today, Jackie. Susan Cameron. You have your hand up.
Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute. Look, just a question there for Jackie. Back to that slide that showed that we have to, or organisations have to consider the psychosocial impacts on, you know, clients and people in the workforce. If you're feeling that that's certainly quite a risk in your organisation, is there anything that Worksafe can do to address building resilience in the workforce around the current COVID-19 situation? Or is that something the organisation would have to seek independently?
So we actually launched our first managing work-related psychological hazards strategy in National Safe Work Month, so last month. I'll send a copy through to Kerry and yourself, Susan, and you can disseminate it. It's around building capability and maturity in ACT workplaces to both identify and manage psychosocial hazards. So in the ACT, compared to other jurisdictions, we're actually quite good, but there is a lot of work that we can do to be more mature in this space. So yes, there is absolutely stuff that will be coming out from Worksafe ACT to assist in that. The other tool that is available now, and it is a really great tool, it's co-funded by all of the Worksafes and SafeWorks all around Australia, is called the People at Work tool. And it is actually an evidence-based survey for your workplace around identifying and managing psychosocial hazards. So that's another thing I'll send a link through to. It is fantastic. It's really, really good as a one-off, and it is even better when it's something that you can redo with your workforce every 6 to 12 months. And there are heaps of resources for the People at Work website that you guys can have a look at and use. It's really fantastic, and I'll send through those details to Kerry for sure.
Fabulous. So thank you for that, Jackie. Look, we might start to wrap up. I mean, look, this has been an absolutely excellent session, Jackie, and you know, I've learned so much today, and I'm sure everybody online has as well. So I just want to take this opportunity to really thank you for giving up some time today, and I'm really looking forward to working with you, you know, more closely going forward into the future. I'm keen to run a few more workshops and things. So virtual claps and thanks. And we'll talk to everybody soon. Now, just to let everybody know as well that the recording and the slides will be made available to everybody. And once again, thank you. Have a great day. Stay safe and talk to you all very, very soon. Bye for now.